Northminster for over 20 years now on a regular basis. Some of the finest performers that you will ever hear, no matter where you go. So we are indeed honored once again to welcome Richard Dowling, piano, and Evan Drachman, cello. Evan came for the very first piano concert, and I don't remember when that was. It was in the 90s here at Northminster. And he and Richard will speak more about their instruments, their careers, and about specifically the Agorska Foundation and what they do. We have a lot of information in the programs, and I encourage you to read that. And included in that is a membership form, because you'll find that the work of this organization is something that you hopefully would like to support financially, because it's indeed a ministry to people who do not have access to music of this quality. I'd like to remind you to silence any sound making equipment that you might have on your person. And there is, thanks to our hospitality commission, a reception following, which you'll be able to meet the performers. And there are, thankfully, CDs available, so you'll be able to take a little of this music home. So we'd like to welcome Evan Drachman, cello, and Richard Dowling, piano.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be back in Monroe at this gorgeous church. Richard and I have played here many times, and we always look forward to it. It's not very common, actually, that we get to play in a space that has such beautiful acoustics. So it's a treat for us. We'll talk about ourselves. I think there are biographies of both Richard and me in the program. And so we don't want to bore you with too many details about our lives. There are a couple of things that tend to get left out of my biography. One thing that audiences often like to know is that my grandfather was the Russian cellist, Gregor Piatigorsky. I should correct that, the Ukrainian cellist, Gregor Piatigorsky. He came from a town called Ekaterinoslav in Ukraine. He always, of course, it was part of Russia when he was growing up, and so he always called himself Russian. He thought it was sort of interesting that when he came to America, they called him a Russian cellist. And when he went back to Russia, they called him an American cellist. He said, "Nobody wants me." I would also like to introduce you to my cello. This cello is 301 years old. It was made in the year 1721 in Venice, Italy, by one of the greatest instrument makers that ever lived, a man named Dominicus Montagnana. I'm tremendously lucky to get to play on this cello. The one other thing that tends to get left out of my biography, and the question that I most often hear asked, is just exactly how tall is he anyway? So I'm 6'5", and I never played basketball. We'd like to start this evening with the fantasy pieces by Robert Schumann, German composer. Schumann was well known as a composer of art song. And even his instrumental work, like these fantasy pieces, are three little songs without words. It has been said that they are love songs. The first one is marked tenderly and with expression. And it's a little bit like when a couple first meets and they start to fall in love. The second work is called Lively Light, and it's sort of the flirtatious part of the relationship. The third movement is fast and with fire, and it's full of passion. There's a middle section in this third fantasy piece that becomes serious. And I often think of that as when, in a relationship, when a couple starts to talk seriously about their future, about their life together. And then the passionate part comes back to finish the third fantasy piece. I hope you enjoy the fantasy pieces by Robert Schumann. Next, we would like to play what is really the main part of our program this evening. This is the Sonata in D major by Felix Mendelssohn. This sonata is, I think, the most joyous piece of music ever written for the cello. Particularly the first movement. It is simply bursting at the seams. It almost can't contain itself. It's ecstatic music. The second movement is marked scherzo. Scherzo in Italian means joke. But this is not exactly a laughing kind of funny joke. This is mercurial wit, tongue-in-cheek kind of biting humor. The composer employs a technique called pizzicato, which is where the cellist plucks the string. There's a gorgeous melodic middle section in this scherzo. The third movement is, I think, the heart of the work. It's the slow movement. And it's interesting because Mendelssohn was born Jewish. His father decided very early on that he didn't stand much of a chance to make a career as a Jew in that part of the world at that time. And so his father converted the entire family. I think this is something that was always on Mendelssohn's mind, sort of in the back of his mind. And this third movement is an interesting kind of a picture. The piano plays what is in essence I believe it's a Lutheran hymn. When the cello comes in, it's with a Hebraic melody. So it's almost like the Jewish boy is walking in church. It's a fascinating movement. At the end of the movement, Mendelssohn uses a technique in the cello which is very rarely used, where the cello plays a low note with the bow, sustains a low note, and at the same time plucks the same pitch with the left hand. It creates a kind of a gong. And if you can imagine, there are exactly 12 of these gongs. So when the clock strikes 12, the carriage turns into a pumpkin, and you launch into the last movement, which is fast and furious and lots of fun to play. I hope you enjoy the 4 movements of Mendelssohn's Sonata in D major. Richard. We were trying with the cello pin on the floor because we thought maybe the acoustics would be a little better. But I'm too far away from Richard. We're better friends than that. That piece is a journey. It's a journey for the musicians and for the audience as well. The last piece we'd like to play for you is the Andante movement from Rachmaninoff's sonata. Rachmaninoff was a great piano virtuoso. He wrote almost all of his music for his own instrument. In fact, this sonata is one of the very few things that he wrote for any other instrument other than the piano. My grandfather, Gregor Piatigorsky, was friends with Rachmaninoff, and he and a colleague, the violinist Nathan Milstein, used to go to Rachmaninoff's apartment in the afternoons, and they would read chamber music for fun. And one day, Milstein, the violinist, got up the nerve and asked him this burning question. He asked Rachmaninoff, he said, "Why don't you write something for the violin?" Well, what Rachmaninoff answered, we cellists have cherished to this day. He said, "Why should I write for the violin when I've got the cello?" I couldn't agree more. This is, I think, one of the most beautiful things ever written for the cello, maybe one of the most beautiful things written for any instrument. I hope you enjoy it. The Andante from Rachmaninoff's sonata for cello and piano. Occasionally, at the end of a concert, that Richard and I really enjoy playing. I think you could see how much fun we were having here this evening. We'll have some questions and answers. And we were wondering if any of you had any questions for us about the music that we played, our instruments, life as a musician.
How old were you when you started playing the cello?
How old was I when I started playing the cello? I actually started pretty late. For a cellist, I started pretty late. I wanted to play the cello very young, and I must have been, I don't know, maybe 4 years old. And I got a tiny little cello. But they really didn't make instruments small like that. And somehow somebody found, maybe my grandfather found a tiny little cello, which I still have. But in those days, they didn't make strings for tiny cellos. So I had to take full-size strings and cut them down, but they were way too thick for such an instrument. And I went to take lessons, and it was a violin teacher trying to hold her violin between her knees to show me how to play. And I wasn't having any of that. So that didn't stick. So I did end up taking other instruments. I played the piano, I played the drums, I played the guitar. And when I was 11 years old, I told my parents that I wanted to play the cello. And they said, sure you do. After all those other instruments, starting them and quitting them, my parents said, get straight A's for a semester, and then we'll see. So I did. I got straight A's. I got the cello, but there's a real learning curve for any string instrument at the very beginning. With the piano, you can sit down at the piano and you press a key and you make a nice sound. But the cello, the violin, the viola, there's a lot of technique before you can make one nice sound on the instrument. And it was a tough beginning for me, starting the cello. So as my mother liked to remind me, in the early days, I would practice as much as 15 minutes a week, whether I needed it or not. And of course, she would always say, you should go to your lesson anyway, at least you'll be playing the cello in your lesson. Well, when I was 13 years old, my parents suggested that I might like to go to a music camp over the summer. So I hadn't played very much cello. I'd been trying different things, and I was very skeptical. And they left this brochure out for me to look at. And it was very intense. Every day there was an hour of orchestra. There was an hour of chamber music. There was an hour private lesson every day. There was an hour of chorus, and there was an hour of individual practice. And I was thinking, 5 hours of music a day versus 15 minutes a week. Then I read a little bit further in the brochure, and it said there were 3 girls to every boy. I thought I might give it a shot. So I went to this camp, and as soon as I had the opportunity to play in an orchestra, to play in a string quartet, to play with piano, I was hooked. I fell so in love with music. After that, it was all I wanted to do. So even though it wasn't until I was 13 that I started to take it seriously, from that point on, it was full steam ahead. I would get up at 5 in the morning to practice before school. I took my cello to school, and every free period I'd practice, and when I got home, it was practice first and then do my homework. So I did have very understanding parents, because not every parent would let their child do that. But that's all I wanted to do. And it's interesting because it hasn't varied from that. It's still all I want to do. It's just, I'm completely in love with music. Some other questions?
Is there such a thing as jazz cello?
There is. So Richard is quite a famous ragtime pianist. He's been on the cover of what's the ragtime, American Ragtime. I mean, he's really, really well known in the ragtime world, and also sort of the jazz world. I mean, with Gershwin, and he's been nudging me to play some jazz with him. And so a friend of his made an arrangement of a piece. We're going to work on it, and we're going to see if I can pull it off.
We'll practice before school.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yes?
Does this cello have a bio itself of past lives that you know about?
This cello has many past lives. It was made for a royal court. And I mean, we know that for sure because we know its history, but also when there was a commission for one of these makers in a royal court, they had plenty of money to buy magnificent wood. And so when you look at the grain on this, on the sides and on the back, it's simply spectacular wood. So it was made for a royal court, and the first cellist to play it was in the orchestra, and he got fired, and he stole the cello. And so the cello, they didn't know where it was for a while, and eventually it surfaced. This cello ended up spending most of its life in collections and being played by amateurs, which has made it, I mean, it's almost in mint condition. It's almost as though it has hardly ever been played. Most cellos, 50 years old, have sustained a lot of damage. This one is in practically perfect condition. So for me, it's very lucky that it was so well protected and cared for. At one time, it was owned by a Dutch baron named Baron Knoop was his name. And he had the finest collection of instruments in the world. And at one time, he owned both this cello and my grandfather's Stradivarius, which has come to this church many times. I'm very spoiled to have two such beautiful cellos, and I don't trade back and forth easily. I'll play on one for years on end, and then something will attract me to the other one, and I'll start playing it, and I can't put it down. And then I'll play that one for years. So I would love to tell you just a little bit about the Piatigorsky Foundation. I'm sure many of you know about the Piatigorsky Foundation. We've been coming to Northminster Church for years and years. It's a nonprofit, a public nonprofit that brings live classical music to people who otherwise might not get to hear it. We perform in churches and synagogues, schools, retirement communities, libraries, prisons, workplaces, anywhere where people gather where they don't normally get live classical music. We had such a struggle during the pandemic. How do you bring live music to people when you're not allowed to see anybody? So of course we did what everybody else did. We tried the virtual route, and we did everything. We had all our artists creating virtual performances. We tried some that were live virtual, and some that were pre-recorded virtual. So we would have an audience would watch a pre-recorded video of a concert that was made specifically for them, and then there'd be a Zoom session where they could talk to the artists and ask them questions. We tried everything, and it was just starting to click when everybody said, we had enough. We don't want to look at a screen anymore, we're done, and we were done too. We wanted our real audience back. It's just not the same thing. I remember playing a recital, and I was in my living room, and we had the microphone and the cameras set up, and played this huge program, and you get to the end of this big piece, and you expect something, some kind of applause. There's nothing, silence. And then there's a little chat box. In that particular performance, there was a chat box where people can write in questions. Nobody wrote anything. I felt like I was playing into a void. So it was over, and they shut down the mic, and they turned off the camera, and I immediately grabbed my phone to see if anyone had texted me. No text. Then I saw one email. The email came in and said, "Good job." I thought, I want an audience. I want my audience back. So I'm very happy to be here.
Are any of those recorded sessions on your website now?
We don't post them just for anyone to watch. They were specifically made for venues. And so what we would do is we'd make them available to that venue for, I don't know, a week or 2 weeks or something, so people who couldn't come at the exact moment that it was aired would also be able to watch it. But we haven't made them public. We didn't get rid of them. We still have the performances, and maybe someday we should post them. But we felt that each venue was paying for a performance, and we wanted it to be specially for them. I did bring along envelopes. We are a public nonprofit, and we survive mostly from donations from our audiences. And the miraculous thing is, during this whole pandemic, our audiences still supported us. They loved the concerts that we did provide for them. They remembered the in-person ones, and we managed to keep our 2 full-time employees fully paid through the entire pandemic, which I'm very happy about. We also have a stack of CDs out there. You might have seen them. I have 3 different CDs which have various things. There's one that has the Schumann fantasy pieces on it. There's one that Richard and I are playing that has the Rachmaninoff, the Andante from the Rachmaninoff Sonata, and one other that has the complete Rachmaninoff Sonata on it. And Richard, you want to tell a little bit about all your, no?
They'll see them when they're eating cookies.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. We've loved playing for you. We're excited to be back here in Monroe and back in front of such a wonderful audience. So thank you.